They planted the fields, they prayed for rain. But when harvest came, there were no buyers, no contracts, no checks, just silence. In just 6 weeks, US farm exports to China dropped 28%. At the port of Oakland, almond and dairy shipments collapsed by 40%. And now hay exporters in Washington are laying off a quarter of their staff because the buyers are gone. And Washington isn't replacing them. This isn't a headline, it's the collapse of the American farm economy. Quiet, fast, and government approved. So ask yourself, how does the richest farm economy on earth wind up begging for markets while its leaders celebrate a trade war? US sorghum exports to China didn't just dip, they were obliterated. In just 2 months, shipments dropped from 1.4 million metric tons in early 2023 to just 78,000 in the same period this year. A 94.4% collapse according to USDA trade data. The reason Beijing's retaliatory tariff regime, now exceeding 125% on US agricultural imports, has rendered American grain not just uncompetitive, but commercially irrelevant in its largest export market. Yet, even as silos overflow and sorghum prices tank with no alternative buyers, the federal response remains symbolic, not structural. The White House's promise that farmers would have a field day now reads less like strategy and more like satire, especially as China pivots to Brazil and Argentina for long-term grain deals. And the question left hanging is, if this wasn't the plan, then why is no one pulling the brakes? The data paints a clear sequence. Tariffs go up, demand disappears, and supply chains reroute permanently. China purchased over 90% of exported US sorghum before the trade war. That pipeline is now severed, but the implications go beyond one crop. As Beijing redirects import contracts toward Latin America, the structural underpinnings of US export dominance are being disassembled at speed. According to Bloomberg, China's soybean imports from Brazil surged 25% year over year, while US soy futures fell over 14% in Q1 2025. These are not tactical shifts, they're permanent rewrites of trade infrastructure. And if American policymakers believe tariffs can be reversed as easily as they were applied, they may be fundamentally misreading how global commodity logistics actually function. At the Port of Oakland, America's #1 gateway for refrigerated agricultural exports, cargo slowdowns are translating into layoffs, demurrage costs, and mounting economic strain. Port Executive Director Christy McKenna warned that retaliatory slowdowns are jeopardizing not just farm exports like almonds, dairy, and beef, but the livelihoods of dock workers, truckers, and warehouse staff. Oakland's 50-50 import-export ratio makes it uniquely vulnerable to trade retaliation. According to port traffic reports, China represents 29% of Oakland's total trade. Volume and retaliatory tariffs are targeting nearly every US export category that moves through it. The concern isn't abstract. It's containers sitting idle, contracts getting cancelled, and exporters eating fees for shipments now abandoned at sea. Forage exporters have reported 68 blanked sailings since Trump announced the April 2nd tariff spike. According to the Agriculture Transportation Coalition, one Washington-based hay supplier laid off 25% of its staff within 2 weeks, citing cancelled shipments and unsustainable freight premiums. Meanwhile, a wood pulp exporter saw 6,400 metric tons of product frozen in warehouse limbo, and 15 railcars incurring demurrage fees while waiting for diversion instructions. One shipment of 9,000 metric tons is en route to China now faces abandonment risk. We cannot absorb ocean freight increases without selling at a loss, one exporter wrote. And the logic unravels quickly. How can low-margin bulk commodities survive a price environment designed for high V-value luxury goods? The USR's new Ships Act port fees exceeding $1.5 million per Chinese vessel exclude bulk agriculture, but not containerized egg, which accounts for 55% of the value of all US egg exports according to USDA figures. That includes beef, poultry, dairy, almonds, frozen foods, and processed items like French fries. Peter Freridman of ATC warned CNBC that this carve-out failure risks punishing the most valuable segment of US farm exports, just as global buyers are abandoning US suppliers. And yet, despite industry pleas, the USR declined to comment on whether exemptions for containerized egg are being considered. With no answer, exporters are left to calculate how many more containers they can ship at a loss before they stop shipping at all. Supply chain adjustments aren't weekend affairs. They're multi-year pivots involving logistics contracts, infrastructure shifts, and new financing. Terms. Brazil's soybean trade with China, for instance, didn't happen overnight. It took 3 years of volume ramp-up, government subsidies, and port upgrades. Now that China has locked in these alternatives, American re-entry into that market, if ever, would require renegotiating from a weakened position. Unlike domestic policy cycles, global agriculture responds to long-term incentives. And the current signal from Washington, according to traders interviewed by Reuters, is instability. So buyers are hedging their bets elsewhere. The danger isn't just losing this year's contracts, it's vanishing from the next decade's spreadsheets. The White House has floated another bailout to save off mass bankruptcies. But multiple farmer associations, including the National Farmers Union and American Soybean Association, are now voicing skepticism. A check doesn't reopen a closed port. It doesn't rebuild a broken contract, and it doesn't replace trust lost with international buyers. In Iowa, corn farmers told Bloomberg they are planting acreage, knowing they will likely lose money simply because not planting at all guarantees bankruptcy faster. In Kentucky, farmers are debating whether to harvest at all. They're not chasing profit anymore. They're triaging losses. And yet, Washington continues to speak in stimulus packages, while the industry itself is asking for one thing only: access to markets. For the first time in years, major farm groups are supporting legislation to restrict White House tariff powers. The National Farmers Union now backs a bill requiring congressional approval for broad trade actions, arguing the unchecked authority has caused disproportionate harm to agriculture. Peter Friedman echoed this, telling CNBC that the current state is not approaching a crisis, but is a full-blown crisis. An industry alignment on this issue is rare, which underscores the urgency. The American Farm Bureau Federation, long seen as a conservative anchor in egg policy, has joined the call for restraint, signaling that the economic cost of unilateral trade war is no longer justifiable, even by those who once supported it. Tariffs are designed to shield domestic producers from cheap imports, but the reality on the ground tells a different story. According to ATC and USDA figures, retaliatory tariffs from China, Canada, and the EU have slashed US farm exports and flooded domestic markets with unsold inventory. China's cancellation of a 12,000-ton US pork order, its largest since 2020, left producers with perishable stock and no fallback buyers. Meanwhile, the USR's port fee rule threatens to compound losses by charging $1.5 million per Chinese vessel, disproportionately affecting containerized agriculture, which represents 55% of US export value. These aren't fringe disruptions, they're structural penalties with no upside for the very farmers tariffs are supposed to protect. The price of food is soaring, but farmers aren't reaping the benefits. While Calen Foods posted over $1 billion in profits during the 2024 egg shortage, smaller producers face feed costs up 20% due to tariffs on Canadian imports. According to Reuters, Trump's new tariff regime, some of the highest in a century, has driven up consumer food prices by nearly 18% year over year. Yet farm incomes, especially for small and mid-sized operations, are falling. This contradiction reflects a deeper issue. Pricing power is increasingly consolidated among processors and distributors, not producers. Tariffs meant to protect US agriculture are instead amplifying corporate markups while pushing independent farmers toward insolvency. US food production is no longer tethered to farmer profitability. It's tied to global trade dynamics and corporate supply chains. Policies dating back to NAFTA and successive farm bills encouraged overproduction while outsourcing price stability to international buyers. That model is now collapsing. Bloomberg notes that over 40% of US soy, corn, and wheat growers report they cannot break even without stable export contracts. As markets vanish and input costs spike, the cracks aren't just in trade, they're in the very system that assumed cheap land, endless growth, and permanent demand. When 68 sailings are cancelled in 1 month and layoffs follow, the signal isn't just pain, it's system failure. During his first term, Trump's tariff war led to over $32 billion in farm bailouts, yet failed to resolve structural trade imbalances. Now his return to punitive tariffs has triggered China's pivot to Brazil and Canada's 25% duty on US agriculture, destroying export momentum and threatening long-term access. According to the Wall Street Journal, rural banks are reporting early signs of credit contraction with loan defaults rising in heavy counties, instead of fostering independence. This cycle of trade war and bailout has created dependency without resilience. Trump promised leverage. What farmers got was volatility, vanishing contracts, and a shrinking customer base. Supply management, once core to New Deal-era farm policy, offered price floors, conservation incentives, and strategic reserves that stabilized incomes and food access alike. Research from the University of Missouri shows that maintaining such policies through 2020 would have cost 37% less than bailout programs while preserving export competitiveness. Paired with industrial strategy like the CHIPS Act and climate-smart subsidies, tariffs can work, but only if they're part of a coherent policy that tackles monopolies, supports infrastructure, and restores farmer autonomy. Right now, none of that exists. We're using 1930s tools with no 21st century map, and farmers are paying the price for every missed step. So what happens when a trade war becomes a full-blown collapse of trust between farmers and markets, policy and promises, Washington, and the people who put food on the table? That's not a hypothetical. It's happening. And while tariffs grab headlines, the real question is this. When every ship gets reroaded, every contract gets cancelled, and every bailout runs dry, who's still standing in America's farm belt? Because the next move won't be about tariffs. It'll be about survival. And the clock's still ticking. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe.